At 3:58 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the Harborline Casino's automated payout system approved what appeared to be a routine transaction. The overnight shift manager barely glanced at the notification that crossed his screen. No celebration, no crowd, no security alert. Just a quiet number, $37,000. The winner wasn't a high roller whose name the pit bosses whispered with mixture of respect and wariness. He wasn't a celebrity whose presence drew photographers and curious onlookers. He wasn't even what most people would recognize as a gambler, someone who lived for the rush of risk and the intoxication of uncertainty. He was a research assistant named Daniel Frost, a man who had treated the casino like it was nothing more than an unusually lucrative data set and who had patiently, methodically, waited for mathematics to perform its inevitable work. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated. Drop your city or country in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where viewers are watching from around the world. Daniel Frost was 29 when his relationship with the Harborline Casino began, though relationship suggested something more emotional than what actually existed. He was in almost every way unremarkable to casual observers. His title at Grantham University was Research Assistant, Statistics Department, a position in academia's perpetual twilight zone. Too educated to be dismissed, too junior to be respected. He worked on short-term grants, lived modestly on stipends, inhabited a studio apartment near campus. His days followed patterns that would have bored most people into despair. He cleaned data sets with monkish dedication, removing outliers and correcting errors that others had made. He checked statistical models, running diagnostics that turned raw numbers into meaningful conclusions. He prepared tables and graphs for research papers on which his name would appear in tiny font in the acknowledgments section, if it appeared at all. The professors whose names headlined the publications would present the findings at conferences while Daniel remained in the lab, already working on the next project. But those who worked closely with Daniel recognized qualities that transcended his humble position. He possessed patience that seemed almost supernatural in an age of instant gratification. His precision was legendary among the graduate students who learned to triple-check their work before showing it to him. And he had an almost preternatural ability to spot anomalies in data, to notice the subtle discrepancies that others overlooked in their rush toward conclusions. Daniel Frost didn't chase money. He had never been motivated by wealth or status or the trappings of success. What drove him, what made him lean forward in his chair during the long hours after everyone else had gone home, was something more fundamental. He chased patterns. He hunted for the underlying structures that governed seemingly random events. He found beauty in probability distributions and satisfaction in confirmed hypotheses. It was this orientation toward the world that would eventually lead him to view the Harborline Casino not as a place of entertainment or vice, but as something far more interesting, a perfect statistical environment waiting to be understood. Daniel's first casino visit hadn't been his idea. A colleague celebrating a grant organized a group outing. Daniel expected noise, poor decisions disguised as entertainment, and a modest loss serving as admission to a story. What he found made his researcher's mind snap into focus. The casino wasn't what he had imagined. Yes, there were the obvious elements. The calculated design meant to disorient and encourage prolonged stays. The absence of clocks and windows, the strategic placement of ATMs and bars. But beneath these surface features, Daniel perceived something else entirely. He saw a massive, functioning statistical environment operating in real time. Every game was a probability distribution being sampled thousands of times per hour. Every player was an agent making decisions based on incomplete information and cognitive biases that had been documented in research papers for decades. While his colleagues laughed and made increasingly poor decisions at a blackjack table, Daniel watched. He observed not just the cards, but the patterns of behavior. He noticed how players reacted to short-term variance, how they abandoned strategies after losses, how they increased bets emotionally rather than rationally. He saw how the structure of the games channeled these human tendencies toward statistically predictable outcomes. Most crucially, Daniel realized something that seemed obvious once articulated, but that most people never quite grasped. Casinos didn't rely on impossible odds. The house edge in most games was actually quite modest. A few percentage points, sometimes less. The casino's real advantage wasn't in the mathematics of the games themselves. It was in human inconsistency. Players misunderstood variance, mistaking short-term fluctuations for meaningful patterns. They reacted emotionally to wins and losses, abandoning discipline precisely when discipline mattered most. They overexposed themselves financially, making bets they couldn't sustain through inevitable downswings. They got tired, drunk, bored, or reckless, and these states of mind translated directly into mathematical advantage for the house. The casino's business model assumed these mistakes. It was built on them. The complimentary drinks, the lack of clocks, the maze-like layouts that made exits hard to find. All of these environmental features existed to encourage the human behaviors that turned modest house edges into massive profits. As Daniel rode the bus back to his apartment that night, while his colleagues compared their losses with rueful laughter, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had observed. Not because he thought he had discovered some secret vulnerability, but because he recognized that the casino represented a kind of experiment, one where the vast majority of participants unknowingly volunteered to serve as the control group. But what would happen, he wondered, if someone approached this environment with the same rigor they brought to actual research? What if someone treated every session like data collection rather than entertainment? What if someone simply didn't make the mistakes the casino expected? Over following weeks, Daniel returned to these questions during quiet hours. While running analyses, he thought about probability. While cleaning data, he thought about variance. While reviewing protocols, he thought about discipline. He began visiting the casino to observe, not to play. He took a notebook, documented patterns systematically. The data confirmed his suspicion. The casino's advantage existed almost entirely in the gap between what players should do and what they actually did. Daniel began to formulate what he thought of as his hypothesis. A player who could maintain perfect consistency, who could execute a strategy without deviation, who could treat each session as part of a long-term study rather than a discrete event, might be able to neutralize or even reverse the expected outcome. This wasn't about finding a trick or exploiting a flaw in the games themselves. Every move he would make would be entirely legal, following posted rules and published odds. The advantage wouldn't come from doing something the casino didn't allow. It would come from not doing things the casino expected. But hypotheses required testing, and testing required capital. Daniel looked at his modest savings with the clear-eyed assessment of a researcher evaluating available resources. He had enough to begin a small-scale experiment, assuming he maintained strict protocols about exposure and risk. He spent 3 weeks designing his framework, approaching the task with the same rigor he brought to academic research. He established clear rules for every aspect of his casino sessions: entry conditions, exit conditions, bet sizing, game selection, session length, and most importantly, the circumstances under which he would stop entirely. These rules were not aspirational guidelines. They were protocol, as binding as the procedures in a laboratory experiment. Deviating from them would invalidate the data. Breaking them would turn the entire exercise into what everyone else was doing, gambling based on feeling rather than method. Daniel's first session following his new protocol lasted 47 minutes. He had established a maximum session length of 90 minutes regardless of outcomes, but he triggered an exit condition earlier when he reached his predetermined win threshold for that particular evening. He left while he was ahead, walking past players who were increasing their bets in response to wins, past players who were chasing losses, past all the familiar patterns of behavior that the casino counted on. In his apartment later that night, he entered the results into a spreadsheet he had created specifically for this purpose. Columns tracked dates, starting bankroll, ending bankroll, time duration, number of decisions made, and qualitative notes about discipline and adherence to protocol. He wasn't trying to predict whether he would be up or down on any given session. Over small sample sizes, variance would dominate. What mattered was whether he could maintain consistency across many sessions. The early weeks were exactly what probability theory suggested they would be: random. Some sessions ended in modest profits, others ended at loss limit thresholds. The variance was substantial, as expected. What didn't vary was Daniel's adherence to protocol. When he hit an exit condition, he left. When the session timer reached its limit, he left. When he felt fatigue beginning to compromise decision-making, he left. To casino personnel, if they noticed him at all, Daniel appeared utterly unremarkable. He didn't play the high-limit tables that attracted management attention. He didn't socialize or drink. He didn't display emotion when winning or losing. He was simply another quiet player, his sessions brief enough that they left no impression, his betting moderate enough that it triggered no alerts. This anonymity was valuable, though not in the way most casino stories suggest. Daniel wasn't trying to hide something illicit. He was simply avoiding the kind of attention that might lead to distractions or conversations that would break his concentration. He was there to execute protocol, not to experience the casino as entertainment. Months passed. The spreadsheet grew longer. The sample size increased. And gradually, beneath the noise of short-term variance, a signal began to emerge. The mathematics was working. Not because Daniel was doing anything extraordinary, but because he was maintaining consistency that apparently was extraordinary, simply by virtue of being sustained over time. His bankroll grew slowly, incrementally, unremarkably on any individual session. There were losing weeks, there were losing months, but over the larger time frame, the cumulative effect of never deviating, never making emotional decisions, never overexposing himself beyond calculated risk parameters, began to compound. Daniel continued his job at the university. He published no papers about his casino experiment. This was personal research, conducted outside academic channels. To his colleagues, he remained the same quiet, methodical research assistant who cleaned their data and checked their models. Nothing in his lifestyle changed noticeably. He still lived in the same modest apartment, still ate lunch in the faculty cafeteria, still spent weekends in the lab when grants required weekend work. But the numbers in his private spreadsheet told a different story. They told the story of what happens when someone treats probability not as a game, but as a predictable phenomenon to be patiently harvested over time. By the end of the first year, Daniel had turned his initial modest bankroll into something substantially larger. Not through dramatic wins or lucky streaks, but through the mathematical reality of consistent positive expectation maintained over hundreds of sessions. The total wasn't life-changing yet, but it confirmed that his hypothesis had predictive validity. More importantly, the psychological demands of perfect consistency had proven sustainable. Some casino stories involve systems that are theoretically sound, but practically impossible because they require superhuman discipline or concentration. Daniel's approach worked precisely because it was designed for his capabilities. The protocols were strict, but not unrealistic. The session lengths were limited specifically to avoid fatigue. The bet sizing never created emotional attachment to outcomes. He adjusted his framework based on data analysis, making small refinements to protocols as his sample size grew large enough to identify optimization opportunities. These weren't dramatic changes, but incremental improvements. The kind of methodological adjustments that researchers make when initial experiments reveal details that weren't visible in planning stages. His bankroll crossed thresholds that changed the mathematics of what was possible. Larger capital allowed for slightly larger bets while maintaining the same risk ratios. Larger bets, executed with the same consistent methodology, produced larger absolute gains, even though the percentage returns remained similar. This compounding effect was neither mysterious nor surprising. It was simply exponential growth applied to a positive expectation system. To the casino's automated monitoring systems, Daniel still appeared unremarkable. His play didn't trigger any of the usual red flags that casinos watch for. He wasn't counting cards or using prohibited techniques. He wasn't colluding with other players or using devices. He was simply playing games within their rules, making decisions that weren't notably different from basic strategy, and leaving when he had determined he should leave, rather than when the casino hoped he would leave. The second year brought larger absolute gains as his growing bankroll allowed for appropriate scaling. The third year accelerated this progression. Daniel had moved beyond the modest wins that could be attributed to luck. The sample size was now large enough that statistical significance was undeniable. This wasn't variance. This was signal. He maintained his research position at the university, though his motivation for keeping the job had shifted. The income was no longer necessary, but the structure provided useful cover. It gave him a legitimate identity and daily routine that had nothing to do with casinos. It prevented the lifestyle changes that might attract attention from either casino security or social circles. His colleagues noticed nothing unusual. The graduate students still sought his advice on statistical analyses. The professors still assigned him data cleaning tasks. He still ate the same inexpensive lunches, still wore the same functional wardrobe, still lived in the same small apartment near campus. But privately, the numbers had crossed into territory that made Daniel begin thinking about endpoints. The original experiment had been open-ended, designed to continue as long as the methodology remained effective. But as the cumulative total grew from significant to substantial to genuinely large, practical considerations emerge. Large sums attract attention through mechanisms that have nothing to do with methodology. Tax implications become complex. Banking relationships become questions rather than transactions. The larger the total, the more difficult it becomes to maintain the anonymity that had been strategically valuable. Daniel began establishing exit conditions for the experiment itself, not just for individual sessions. He set a target number, specific, predetermined, non-negotiable. When he reached that threshold, he would stop entirely. The experiment would be complete. The hypothesis would be tested to satisfaction. And he would close this chapter with the same discipline he had brought to opening it. The number Daniel chose as his exit condition was $37,000, a prime number, large enough to be life-changing, specific enough to represent intentional planning. As his total approached this threshold during year 4, Daniel experienced something he deliberately avoided: anticipation. Not excitement, but the sense of approaching completion. The final sessions leading up to the threshold were in some ways the most dangerous, psychologically. This was when emotional attachment to the goal could compromise discipline. This was when someone might deviate from protocol, might take unnecessary risks to accelerate progress toward the finish line, might make exactly the kinds of mistakes that his entire methodology had been designed to avoid. Daniel maintained protocol with the same rigor he had displayed from the beginning. He didn't increase bet sizes beyond what his capital allocation strategy dictated. He didn't extend session lengths. He didn't take risks that violated his carefully calibrated parameters. When he hit exit conditions, he left, even if it meant walking away from a table where conditions appeared favorable. The night he crossed the threshold, the actual moment was anticlimactic in exactly the way that most of his sessions had been. There was no dramatic final hand or spin, no crowd gathering to witness a milestone, just another routine win during another routine session, and then a glance at his mental accounting that confirmed he had reached the predetermined exit condition for the entire experiment. Daniel completed that session according to protocol. He didn't abruptly leave just because he had hit his number. He finished the planned duration, followed his exit procedures, and walked out of the Harborline Casino with the same unhurried, unremarkable departure that had characterized hundreds of previous exits. In his apartment, he updated his spreadsheet one final time. The numbers confirmed what he already knew: $37,000 in cumulative wins, acquired over 4 years through systematic application of consistent methodology. The sample size was massive: thousands of individual sessions, tens of thousands of individual decisions. The statistical significance was overwhelming. The hypothesis had been thoroughly tested and confirmed. What Daniel had accomplished was not magic. It wasn't even particularly mysterious once explained. He had identified an environment where human behavioral inconsistency created opportunity for those willing to maintain perfect consistency. He had designed protocols that were psychologically sustainable over long time frames. He had executed those protocols without deviation, despite the inevitable variance and the substantial emotional challenges of doing so. And he had proven that discipline, applied with sufficient rigor over sufficient time, could overcome the mathematical advantages that casinos relied upon. The casino systems flagged Daniel's account 48 hours after his final session. Security analysts pulled years of records examining betting patterns, game selections, session durations. They looked for card counting, edge sorting, collusion, device usage. Every analysis returned the same conclusion: nothing violated posted rules. What the data revealed instead was something more subtle and, in some ways, more unsettling to casino management. Perfect consistency maintained over an unprecedented time frame. Every session ended at predetermined thresholds. No emotional chasing of losses, no excitement-driven extension of winning sessions, no variance in discipline despite years of play. A senior analyst summarized the findings in a memo that would circulate among executive management. Subject displays no prohibited behaviors. All play is within posted rules. However, subject demonstrates discipline levels inconsistent with typical player psychology. Recommendation: review for potential policy implications. The casino found itself in an unusual position. They couldn't dispute the legitimacy of the wins. Every session had been conducted legally, every payout properly authorized at the time. They couldn't ban Daniel for cheating because he hadn't cheated. They couldn't claim he had violated policies because he hadn't. What Daniel had done was exploit not the games, but the expectations. He had recognized that casino business models assume behavioral patterns that he simply didn't display. He had maintained consistency that was technically possible, but practically unprecedented. He had treated the casino not as entertainment, but as a statistical environment to be systematically engaged with over time. Internal discussions at Harborline Casino management level revealed the uncomfortable reality of the situation. One executive framed it with stark clarity during a conference room meeting. "He didn't beat our games. He beat our assumptions about how people play our games." The casino could have attempted various countermeasures. They could have invoked their right to refuse service. They could have restructured their policies to make his approach more difficult. But Daniel's timing proved impeccable. By the time casino management was reviewing his activity in detail, he had already stopped playing. He had reached his predetermined exit condition, completed his experiment, and closed his account through normal procedures. When casino security finally attempted to contact Daniel for what they termed a routine conversation, they discovered he had withdrawn all funds through legitimate channels, closed his player account, and effectively disappeared from their customer database. His contact information led to a disconnected phone number and an apartment lease that had recently been terminated. The casino was left with a file documenting an unprecedented case, not of cheating or prohibited behavior, but of discipline applied so consistently over such a long period that it had overcome the statistical advantages they relied upon. The case became a subject of quiet discussion among casino security professionals, shared as a cautionary tale about the limits of behavioral expectations. Daniel's departure from his research position at Grantham University followed procedures that raised no suspicions. He submitted resignation paperwork citing personal reasons, finished his current project assignments, and transferred documentation to colleagues who would continue his unfinished work. The professors he had supported thanked him for his years of service and wished him well in whatever came next. The graduate students lamented losing someone who had helped them understand statistical methods, but accepted his departure with the resigned awareness that research assistants rarely stayed in such positions indefinitely. No one in his academic circles had any reason to connect his resignation with unusual financial circumstances. Daniel had maintained his modest lifestyle throughout his casino experiment, showing no external signs of changed circumstances. His apartment near campus remained simple and sparsely furnished until the day he moved out. His wardrobe never expanded beyond functional basics. His social habits never shifted toward the kind of conspicuous consumption that might have prompted questions. The first financial decisions Daniel made with his casino winnings were characteristically methodical. He established legal structures to manage the capital, consulting with attorneys and accountants who specialized in large-sum financial planning. He paid all applicable taxes immediately and completely, creating a transparent record that would never become complicated by attempts at evasion or hiding assets. He allocated portions of the total toward various purposes, each decision made with the same careful analysis he had brought to designing his casino protocols. A significant portion went toward paying off debts, not his own, as he had managed to avoid substantial personal debt through years of careful budgeting, but rather debts belonging to his parents, whose modest retirement had been complicated by medical expenses and reverse mortgage arrangements that threatened their housing security. Daniel's parents were baffled by his sudden ability to eliminate their financial anxieties, and he offered only vague explanations about successful investments and good fortune. Another substantial allocation went toward funding independent research projects that Daniel had long considered intellectually fascinating but that existed far outside the boundaries of fundable academic work. He established small grants for researchers working on questions that major funding agencies considered too speculative or too far from practical applications. He did this anonymously through a foundation structure that revealed nothing about the source of the capital, enjoying the irony that his casino experiment was now enabling exactly the kind of patient, careful research that had trained him to execute that experiment in the first place. Daniel bought a home, though nothing ostentatious, a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood where his presence would attract no particular attention. He established investment accounts designed for long-term stability rather than aggressive growth, applying the same risk management principles that had governed his casino play. He created a lifestyle that provided comfort and security without crossing into the kind of wealth display that invites scrutiny or complicates simple existence. Most importantly, Daniel completely and permanently ended his relationship with casinos. He didn't gradually reduce his play or occasionally return for just one more session. He made a clean break with the same finality that researchers bring to closing out completed experiments. The Harborline Casino and every other casino became places that existed in his past but would play no role in his future. This total cessation was perhaps the strongest evidence of the discipline that had enabled his success. Many people who experience significant wins in casinos find themselves drawn back by the memory of success or the hope of repeating it. The psychological pull of gambling environments affects even those who approach them systematically. But Daniel had never been gambling in the emotional sense. He had been conducting a long-term experiment with predetermined endpoints. When the experiment concluded, the behavior ended. In the years that followed his departure from the casino world, Daniel found himself occasionally thinking about his 4-year experiment, but not with the nostalgia or longing that might have indicated unresolved attachment. Rather, he thought about it the way researchers think about completed projects, with satisfaction at having tested a hypothesis thoroughly, with interest in what the results revealed about statistical principles and human behavior, with appreciation for what the experience had taught him about discipline and methodology. He never publicly discussed what he had accomplished. There were no interviews granted, no books written, no seminars offered on replicating his approach. This silence wasn't motivated by fear of casino countermeasures or legal complications. Everything he had done was entirely legal, and he had no intention of ever returning to that environment. Rather, it was motivated by the same preference for anonymity that had characterized his entire approach. He had no interest in becoming a public figure associated with casino success or in dealing with the inevitable requests from people seeking shortcuts to similar outcomes. The narrative of Daniel Frost's casino experiment resists simple categorization. It was not a story of gambling in the traditional sense, because gambling implies acceptance of fundamental uncertainty and negative expectation. It was not a story of cheating or exploitation, because every action he took fell within the posted rules and published guidelines of casino operations. It was not a story of discovering hidden secrets, because the mathematical realities he worked with were thoroughly documented in probability textbooks and academic research. What made Daniel's story unusual was not what he knew, but what he did with what he knew. The mathematics of casino games has been published and available for decades. The psychological patterns that make casinos profitable have been studied extensively in behavioral economics and cognitive psychology research. The importance of discipline in any endeavor involving probability and variance is hardly a revelation. Daniel's contribution wasn't discovering these truths, but living them with completeness that proved extraordinarily rare. He demonstrated that theoretical knowledge becomes practical advantage only when executed with perfect consistency over sufficient time. He proved that discipline, while conceptually simple, is operationally difficult enough that maintaining it creates genuine edge, even in environments specifically designed to exploit human behavioral inconsistencies. The casino's fundamental business model remained sound after Daniel's departure. The vast majority of players continued to display the behavioral patterns that made casino operations profitable. They continued to misunderstand variance, to make emotional decisions, to abandon strategies after short-term losses, to overexpose themselves financially, to stay too long, to drink too much, to chase losses, to increase bets after wins based on feelings of luck rather than mathematical rationale. What Daniel had demonstrated was not a vulnerability in casino games, but a vulnerability in casino assumptions about player behavior. The house edge in most games remains exactly what it has always been, a small mathematical advantage that, multiplied across millions of bets, generates reliable profits. But that advantage depends on players behaving in psychologically typical ways. For the individual player who asked what lessons might be extracted from Daniel's story, the answers were both obvious and challenging. The obvious part, consistency, discipline, and long-term thinking can overcome modest negative expectations in many domains, not just casinos. The challenging part, actually maintaining such consistency over years through inevitable variance and emotional ups and downs, proves extraordinarily difficult for most people. Daniel succeeded not because he possessed secret information or because he found a cheat code, but because he possessed psychological characteristics, patience, precision, emotional regulation, adherence to protocol, that he had developed through years of academic research training. These characteristics weren't innate gifts, but cultivated skills, though cultivated over a longer time frame than most people would invest in any single pursuit. The story also illustrated something important about edges and advantages in general. In competitive environments, true edge rarely comes from knowing something others don't know. Information spreads quickly in the modern world, and most supposedly, secret methods are either widely known or don't actually work. Sustainable edge more often comes from doing what others know they should do, but don't actually do. Maintaining the discipline, consistency, and emotional control that knowledge alone doesn't provide. Casinos continue to operate profitably because they correctly understand that knowledge and execution are different things. They can publish the house edge for every game. They can make basic strategy charts available for blackjack. They can provide comprehensive information about odds and probabilities. None of this significantly affects their bottom line because the overwhelming majority of players will, over time, deviate from optimal play in ways that compound to the house's advantage. Daniel's experiment proved that this deviation isn't inevitable, just highly probable. A player with sufficient discipline can maintain optimal play over sufficient time to overcome modest house edges. But the key words are sufficient discipline and sufficient time, both of which translate to psychological demands that filter out most people. In the end, Daniel Frost's story lacks the dramatic arc that casino narratives typically follow. There was no single night of breakthrough success, no dramatic confrontation with casino security, no narrow escape from countermeasures, no celebrity status or media attention, no sequel where success leads to downfall. Instead, there was a quiet beginning where a research assistant recognized that his professional skills might apply in an unusual context. A long middle where consistency was maintained session after session, month after month, year after year, without wavering or deviation, and a quiet end where predetermined exit conditions were reached and the experiment concluded with the same methodical finality that characterized its execution. Daniel moved on to a life that bore no outward signs of unusual financial success. He pursued interests that had always fascinated him, but that he hadn't been able to prioritize when living on research stipends. He funded work that he believed deserved support, but couldn't get traditional funding. He helped family members achieve stability they couldn't have reached otherwise. He created a comfortable but not ostentatious existence that allowed him to focus on what actually interested him, rather than what paid the bills. For casino security professionals, the Daniel Frost case file remained a subject of occasional discussion. An example of how assumptions about player behavior, while correct in aggregate, can be defeated by individuals who don't conform to typical patterns. Some casinos implemented minor policy adjustments in response to the lessons his case revealed. Others concluded that players with Daniel's level of discipline were rare enough that systematic countermeasures weren't worth the cost of implementation. For other players who heard rumors of someone who had won enormous sums through discipline and consistency, the story usually prompted one of two reactions. Some dismissed it as impossible or embellished, unable to believe that simple consistency could overcome the house edge without some trick or secret angle. Others became briefly inspired to attempt similar approaches, only to discover that maintaining perfect discipline through variance and emotional challenges was far more difficult than they had imagined. What very few people appreciated was that Daniel's success had required not just the 4 years of casino sessions, but the many preceding years that had developed the psychological capabilities those sessions demanded. His patience had been cultivated through academic research that required waiting months or years for experiments to yield data. His precision had been honed through work where small errors could invalidate entire studies. His comfort with variance had been developed through understanding statistical principles deeply enough that short-term fluctuations didn't provoke emotional responses. In a sense, Daniel's casino experiment had been funded not by his modest savings, but by years of academic training that most people never receive. The $37,000 wasn't won in 4 years. It was won in perhaps 10 or 15 years, if one counted the time required to develop capabilities that made the experiment possible. This longer time frame made the story both more impressive and less replicable. It was more impressive because it revealed the depth of preparation and cultivation required for what appeared to be simple consistency. It was less replicable because few people would invest years developing such capabilities for an eventual casino application that remained entirely hypothetical until proven. Years after Daniel's final session at the Harborline Casino, the building still stands, its lights still glowing through the night, its games still running according to the same mathematical principles. New players arrive every day, most of them destined to contribute to the house advantage through the same behavioral patterns that have always made casinos profitable. The managers still watch their monitors, the dealers still shuffle their cards, the machines still spin their reels. And somewhere far from that environment, a former research assistant lives quietly, having demonstrated something that remains philosophically interesting even if practically rare. That perfect execution of sound principles, maintained over sufficient time, can overcome modest mathematical disadvantages, and that discipline itself, boring, unsexy, methodical discipline, represents perhaps the most underestimated advantage available to human beings willing to cultivate it. The question that Daniel's story poses isn't whether casinos are beatable. They clearly are, at least by players willing to meet extraordinary standards of consistency. The question is whether most people possess or can develop the psychological characteristics required to maintain such consistency through inevitable variance, emotional challenges, and the long time frames necessary for statistical significance. Daniel's answer, demonstrated through action rather than words, was yes, but only for those rare individuals willing to treat the process not as gambling, but as research, not as entertainment, but as methodology, not as a game of chance, but as a long-term experiment in applied probability and disciplined execution. The $37,000 was real. The method was legitimate. The outcome was proven. But the lesson wasn't that anyone could replicate his success. The lesson was that knowledge without execution is merely interesting, while execution without consistency is merely gambling. And only the combination of knowledge, execution, and unwavering consistency over sufficient time creates the kind of outcome that Daniel Frost achieved. And that lesson, like most true insights, is both obvious once stated and extraordinarily difficult to actually implement.